Hello, I'm Claudia Bouvier. I'm co-founder of Pastificio Boulder in Boulder. We specialize in pastas made out of heritage and ancient wheat varieties. And I'm going to teach a handmade pasta workshop today. So I have a whole list here of things that I want to talk to you about. I wish we were doing this in person, but I guess Grain School is virtually this year. We're excited to be here and to share a little bit of what we have been making in Boulder. So Pastificio Boulder is a heritage and ancient wheat pasta company. We specialize in those different varieties of wheats because we believe that there's so much more flavor and in those unique and different grains. So it's flavor, it's because of nutrition, and it's also because it gives us the ability to work with local farmers and be in close contact with them. And by using those wheats, we are also supporting biodiversity in our farms, which is, at least for us at Pastificio, part of our mission to support and to nurture biodiversity in our current food system. So what we do, we get the majority of our wheat in berry form, and we get those grains, different kinds. Like this one, it's called Blue Hammer. This one is Red 5. They both came from a farm that is about 14 miles from us. It's called Aspen Moon Farm. We work a lot with them. So basically we get those grains like this in berry form, and we mill them in-house. We use a technique or a milling technique called impact milling because we need the flour to be very fine. Quite often in the beginning when I started researching pasta and talking to people about whole grain, one of the biggest feedbacks we had was, oh, whole grain pasta, it's really coarse and it has like a cardboard kind of texture. So we decided that we needed to mill our own flour because this technique gives us whole grain flour, but with a texture that is much finer than in stone grinding, and it gives us the ability to add much more whole grain to our blends. So we work with a bunch of different kinds of wheats. Every pasta that we make have at least 2 or 3 different varieties. Durum is the basis of pasta. There is a reason why in Italy the majority of the pasta that you are going to find is made out of durum. It's a very hard wheat, and it's the majority of the wheat that we use. We also use camu. Camu is the brand name in America, and it's a wheat called Croissant. And we use different heritage varieties, Red 5, Turkey Red, Blue Hammer. And for every pasta we make, we use different blends. We always have at least at the bare minimum 50% of whole grain flour. It can vary from 50 to 100. There are different collaborations that we make with farmers, and we use 100% whole grain in those pastas. So in terms of pasta making, there are 2 big groups. One is the handmade pasta, where you mix the flour with eggs or flour and water, depending on what you want to do. and you develop the gluten as you are incorporating the either egg or water to the flour. So you really need, and you develop a dough and you're developing the gluten, you need to let it rest for a while, and we're going to talk about this. And then you work on it. You either open with a machine like this or with a rolling pin called mattarello, and then you transform it into different shapes. The second way of making pasta, and it's what we mostly do here at Pastificio, is by extruding, and the process is quite different. So the extrusion is basically using a machine called extruder. So what we do is we get our flour, we mix with water. Sometimes we use eggs too, but the majority is flour and water, and then we combine them. In the beginning we were using a big mixer. Now our extruder is bigger, and it has a part of it that it mixes the dough, but you don't get to the point that you develop the gluten, you just combine them. So once you have that flour and water incorporated, and it kind of almost looks like sand, what you do is the machine is going to press the dough through a barrel, and it's going to come out through a part called die. Die is basically a big metal plate. Ours is made out of bronze, and that plate has different kinds of perforations. Depending on how those perforations are designed, it's the shape that that die is going to make. So we just press. It has a tiny bit of heat. We can control that. We can control the speed. We can control the amount of heat, but basically the shape comes out. And after that, we let it dry for 36 to 48 hours at a very controlled environment. We control the humidity, we control the temperature and ventilation, because this lower and at the low temperature, the better it is for the pasta. You know, the pasta dries from the inside out, and if you let it dry slowly, you are preserving the taste, you're preserving the nutrition, and you're also controlling the structure of the pasta. You know, at big pasta companies, they dry really fast, and the quality is not as good as if you use the more artisanal methods. The other reason why we use the bronze dies is because the kind of, you know, texture that we want in the pasta is the surface to be very porous, and that is going to help, you know, for the sauce to be absorbed, and so that's why we use those bronze dies. So this is one part of what we do, the extrusion. The other part is the handmade pasta, and it's a very artisanal method that we not only try to teach, you know, at Pastificio, not so much right now because of COVID, but we do teach and collaborate different organizations, but also to our kids, and we want to keep the traditions. I have an Italian heritage. My 4 grandparents were born in Italy, even though I grew up in São Paulo, Brazil. But it's something that we try to share and preserve the tradition. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I have a whole list here. So we talked about the milling, the flours for pasta. So as I said, you know, durum is really the main wheat that pasta is made out of. you know, for a good reason. It really gives a bite. It gives the texture, the right texture for pasta. So depending on what you are going to do, you can blend them. You know, I often blend durum, about 2/3 of durum with a softer wheat, because I like the smooth and the silky part of the wheat. So I generally go 2/3 durum and 1/3 white Sonora. It's another beautiful soft wheat that I like to use. If I'm going to make a pasta, like filled pastas that I need more pliability, I might increase the amount of white Sonora, but most often than not, I use durum. Not to say that it's not possible to make pastas out of different wheats. You know, I have done, this is called Blue Emmer, and I have done 100% Blue Emmer, and it's a beautiful wheat and flavor, so you can play with that. But, you know, in order to have a little bit of workability in the dough, it's good to have part of the wheat being hard. So what are all those different kinds of flours that you hear, right? Semola, semolina, doppio zero. What is that? So basically, it's part the kind of wheat that is used, and part the way it's milled. Semolina, which is, you know, very, very common for pasta making. It's basically the white, yellow part of the durum. The endosperm of the durum is yellow, which is the white part, and the semolina comes from the endosperm of the durum. That is basically white, in this case yellow, because durum is yellow, part of the wheat. It's milled very coarsely. You know, you're going to almost find that it looks like polenta, but it's basically wheat. So semolina is really used, especially in the southern part of Italy, you know, where it's hotter, and people normally do flour and water kind of pasta. Semola also comes from the durum, and it's milled a little finer than semolina, but it is again the endosperm of the durum. Doppio zero, it's flour that is milled very powdery, very, very finely. It's normally made for pastas, filled pastas, when you want it to be very stretchy, and very often combined with eggs. If you hear about pastry making, that kind of very fine flour, it's also used, same thing for pizza dough. So those are the different kinds of flours that you can use, and you're going to find at the grocery store. So different kinds of grains, different kinds of pastas. I like to add the soft wheat on the filled pastas, while pastas like orecchietti or something that is not really thin, I like to have a little more bite. So now we're going to talk about the pasta, the handmade pasta. So the most traditional way is when you see at pasta grannies, or you know, any Italian grandmother making pasta, which is basically that method where you put you pour your flour on the counter, and then you make a hole in the middle, like you create a volcano. You crack the eggs inside, and then little by little you mix the flour and the eggs. It's a beautiful way of making pasta. I normally make that on Sundays when I have the girls making pasta with me. It's really time consuming. It's fun, but it's not necessarily the way you need to make pasta. It can get pretty messy. There is the mixer method, which is basically you put the flour inside of the bowl, crack the eggs or water depending on what you're making. You use the hook to create the dough, and then you start mixing it very slowly. I would say probably setting number 2. And then what's going to happen is little by little the egg is going to be incorporated in the flour till it forms a ball. You know, everything it's kind of together, a dough that is together. If the dough is too sticky and sticking on the sides of the bowl, it's because you need a little bit of flour. If it's just rolling around and there's kind of extra flour at the bottom that is not incorporated, then it's because you need to add a little bit of water. I normally have a mist, a little spray, and I go little by little adding till the ball forms. And you know, it's going to take about 6 to 10 minutes for this to happen. And I check every so often to see what's happening. So at that point, you're going to have a dough that is really uneven. And what I normally do is I take from the bowl and I just do the kneading by hand. The kneading, and I did make some dough earlier today. The process is basically, you know, it's going to be very uniform. What you do is you put on the counter, and using this part of your hand, you kind of get the dough to be straight, and then you just press onto itself, I guess that's the term. And then you turn again, and then you press again, and you keep doing till the dough feels more even. It's going to be still have texture. It's not going to be nice and smooth. So you just keep kneading, I would say probably just a few minutes, and then you let the dough rest. Because what you did so far was just to incorporate the moisture, whatever way you're doing, whether it's eggs or water, with the flour. The rest is going to get the flour to hydrate and the gluten to develop. So that's the way I normally do, you know, more often, and here also at Pastificio. And then what you do is you put the dough in a plastic bag and you let it rest for, I would say, at least 30 minutes till it's nice and even, to the point that you can start working and it's more flexible. Now, the different ways of working the dough. After it rests for about 30 minutes, you are going to see that the surface is much smoother than it was, and that it shouldn't be sticky or feeling too dry. It should be at a point that you sense the moisture, but it's not sticking to your hands. So the different ways that you can work that dough, you know, the more traditional, and again, going back to the Italian grandmothers, is when you open with the rolling pin, and they do have a very specific one. It's called mattarello. So it's basically a really long, straight rolling pin, and there's a whole technique to open. You know, you go a couple times one direction, and then you rotate about 90 degrees, and you keep doing. You know, the very traditional way, that dough, when it's open, it's called sfoglia. And the ladies that traditionally make the pasta, they are called sfolina or sfolini, the plural. And it's a beautiful art. It's very complicated to do. It's very difficult. You know, what they say is the right time for you to know if your sfoglia is ready is if you can read the newspaper through it. So it means that it's super thin. So the other way you can do is It's easy. You can buy the manual machines, you know, you clamp them to the counter and you open, you know, you go manually. It's fun. It's super cool to do. If you have kids around, you can work with that. So basically the idea is every one of those machines, there are two rollers and they roll inwards. And every time that you adjust the setting, you're getting those rollers to be closer to each other. So you go little by little by little. Every time you do a pass that you get the dough to roll through, you're getting it to be thinner. So it's exactly the same method. It's just that there's the hand machine. There's something like this, the mixer, you know, KitchenAid has the pasta attachments and you can attach that roller to this. Or the third way is with a professional machine. It's how we use here at Pastificio, which is much more efficient. It's electric, so, you know, the work of rolling, it goes much faster. I think if you're making at home, this works really well, and so does the hand rolling machine. So now what we're going to talk is about how to open the dough and what you have to keep in mind. So after resting for about 30 minutes, you can work the dough in different ways. You know, the more traditional and what makes most of the shapes, it starts with opening, stretching the dough, almost like creating lasagna sheets. And then you can just stop there and make lasagna, or you can work that stretched dough and create fettuccine and cut in different ways, or even make filled pastas like ravioli and tortellini. So the process is basically, you know, I normally get, you know, this batch, which is 2 cups of flour and 3 eggs. You're going to have to adjust depending on the flour that you are using. This is 100% whole grain, 2/3 durum and 1/3 white Sonora. So basically what I do is for this batch, I cut into 4 different pieces. And while I work with one of them, I keep all the other 3 in the bag, otherwise it's going to dry and it's going to be super difficult to open. So just keep them there. And so you get the piece of dough, you just press it to make almost like a little pizza, a little pancake. It's because you need to be somewhat thin to go through the machine, whichever machine you're using. I also have some flour around because as you are stretching the dough, it's getting stickier, and you're going to have to add flour little by little. So just, you know, keep a little bit on the side and add little by little because you don't want to dry the dough either. So you kind of stretch and until it's about like this, you know, thin enough. And the idea is, you know, there are those settings. All the machines have the same kind of settings. So as I'm turning in, the rollers are going inwards. You start with the widest setting and you roll your first, and you keep adjusting. So you just keep rolling. Always try to hold the dough with the side of your fingers. You don't want to pinch. No, this is too wide. I need to make a little thinner. So after you do a couple times, stretch a little more. Yes, once it starts having a little bit of shape, and I'm going to turn off so you can hear me. What you do is you fold the dough with the two ends meeting in the middle. What you're trying to do here, as we are rolling and changing the settings, you are trying to get the dough thinner. But at the same time, you also want to think about the geometry of the pasta, and the more rectangular you can get, the more efficient you're going to be. Just imagine like a really long piece of lasagna sheet. If you're going to make, let's say, fettuccine, you're going to cut that, and you want all your noodles to have the same length. Or if you're using that dough to make ravioli, let's say square raviolis, you want to try to use the most of the dough. So you're thinking about getting it thinner, but at the same time as even and as rectangular as possible. So once you do this, put a little bit of flour both sides, and I'm going to turn this on again. And then you go through the roller. You can go a couple times, and you can change the setting very slowly, very little by little. And then you are going to do that again, folding in the middle. And what you want to do is, let's say we're rolling like this, you want to get the dough and roll in the 90-degree rotation. So just rotate 90 degrees and go again. Why you're doing this? It's because you're creating a stronger gluten mesh. So it's going to be helpful as you're working the dough to get it stronger. So again, you go backwards a little bit once you fold. You open the setting, and then you roll again. So you keep going. Till you're going to start seeing your dough that has a little more shape, and then you keep rolling in a way that you are getting it thinner and thinner. I'm not going to keep doing, I think you got the idea. If it starts to stick to the roller, it's because it's too wet, and then you add a little bit of flour. Just be careful with the flour, because if you get the dough to be a little too dry, then it's harder to go back to add moisture. Again, I do the spray bottle and add a little by little. So once you get to be at this point, you are going to roll, and the thickness is going to depend on what you want to make out of this pasta. If you're doing fettuccine or pappardelle, you want it to be more on the thicker side, while if you're filling the dough, if you're making ravioli or tortellini, you want it to be really thin. I normally don't go all the way to the thinnest setting. It's a little too thin. It's more like to the one before it. So a couple things that you want to think about when you are opening the dough. There are little things here and there besides the geometry that makes everything more efficient, is the way you hold the dough. Normally with the side of your fingers, you don't want to poke any holes there. Also, when you're making it go through the machine, you want to try to keep the dough as straight as possible and not kind of go like this, because it can go sideways, and it's going to mess up your process. The other thing is, if it's starting to have a pretty uneven shape, what you do is you just fold and you go back one setting, and then you roll again. You roll in this direction, you turn 90 degrees, and you roll again in the other direction. So again, that balance of trying to keep the geometry as straight as possible. Things that you might see is when the side starts to get drier and kind of with some edge, it's because it's too dry. Try to put a little bit of water. If you don't have the spray bottle, just get your hands wet and put a little bit on the dough. Don't get the machine wet, just a little bit, tiny bit on the dough, and you start rolling again. So basically the process is just going through this. Don't skip any settings because it might get sticky. Also, if you see that your dough has, it's kind of peeling, kind of sticky, it's because there is too much moisture. So go with the flour little by little. So basically the process that you do is little by little, keep it straight, let it roll through, and then you go again changing the setting. Once you have the dough in the thickness that you want, then you can do different things with it. You know, if you're just cutting the pasta to make fettuccine, pappardelle, or any of the straight noodles, you can use the pastry cutter. Something like this works pretty well. I do love this one. In Italian, it's called the bicicletta, which is basically the bicycle. So you just figure out the width of your noodle, and then you lock, and then you cut. So things to think about. Once you roll, just let the dough dry for a couple minutes, because if you're going to cut right away, they might stick to each other. So let it dry for just a little bit till you can feel that it's not as wet, and then you cut the noodles. Other things that you can make is, cut them in squares. So you just lock the setting, you cut in this direction, you cut in the other one, and you can use something like this. This is a gnocchi board, or you can make another pasta called Garganelli. So basically what it is you get the square of dough, you put in the Garganelli on the board, and then you get the pin and you roll it around. I might do one of those so you can see the process. Or then for filled pastas, if you're doing, this is ravioli stamp. Basically it cuts, but also it seals. It's a whole world of filled pastas, and there's a little more technique required. So my suggestion is play with the flat noodles a couple times before venturing into the filled pastas, because it requires a little more familiarity with the dough. So as I was talking about the Garganelli, and it's a fun shape that I want to show you how to make. So once you get the dough to the thickness you want, and you let it, put a little bit of flour on the surface of the counter. So I'm going to turn this way. So I'm going to cut it in squares, because I can make the Garganelli, and it's a pretty cool one to make here. So you cut one direction, take them to the side. I could have thought about the thickness a little better, but let's just do the squares like this. There we go. All right, so the square is the basis to a bunch of different pasta shapes, including the Garganelli. So what you do here is you have the square, you put it in an angle, and then you get the rolling pin and you roll it around the pan and on the board. And then you can just take it out. So it's super simple to make, and it's a pretty cool shape. It's almost like a handmade penny, I would say. And really fun to make. If you're going to make tortellini, it's the same idea. You cut your squares like this, and you fill, I normally use a pastry bag, so you put the filling inside, and then you roll it. You press the filling inside. When you're making filled pastas, you need to be really careful that you don't leave any air pockets inside of the filling. Otherwise, once you cook, they are going to pop. So basically, just pretend there is some filling inside, and you go around. It's tricky without the filling, but you kind of go around with your fingers, and there is a whole different way of doing it. So this is more the basic of tortellini. But play with the pastas, fettuccinis and tagliarinis and all those the shapes that don't require the filling, and then you go to that. If you're going to make filled pasta, one thing to keep in mind is you don't want your dough to dry, because otherwise it doesn't stick, and then the filling is going to escape. So what I do is I cover them either with a moist tablecloth or a piece of plastic. So you need to control how humid the dough is. Again, you can always get your hands wet and put some moisture back into the dough. What else I was going to say? So for you to keep the pasta, once you shape it, you can just put straight into the boiling water and sauce and just eat it. That's the best way, the freshest, the better. Or you can shape, let's say if it's fettuccine, just make a loose nest, put in a tray, put in the freezer, let it get frozen, and then you can put in an airtight container. It is going to last for quite a while, a few weeks, and then you can just grab from the freezer and go straight to the boiling water. For cooking the pasta, plenty of water and plenty of salt, especially fresh pasta. It doesn't have enough time to absorb the salt. Fresh pasta cooks really fast, a couple minutes. So you want to have your water tasting like seawater. The other thing that we really suggest is to finish cooking the pasta in the sauce. So you have the water boiling, ready to put the pasta, to drop the pasta in it. Have the sauce warming up on a saucepan on the side. As soon as the pasta is cooked, just transfer straight from the water to the sauce and give it, a couple seconds to incorporate a little bit of olive oil, a little bit of pasta water. It's just amazing the difference that it makes. So I guess that's it in terms of handmade pasta. I hope you guys enjoy and keep doing, don't be afraid. It can be intimidating, but it's just flour and eggs and flour and water. There's so much that can go wrong. And if you have any questions ever, you can always feel welcome to either call us or send me an email. Email is better. So my email, direct email is Pastificio Boulder@gmail.com. Just send me your notes and your questions, and we're more than happy to help with pasta making. And lastly, I think the idea of using those unique varieties of wheat, they do really make the pasta or bread or whatever you're making have so much more taste. Regular white flour doesn't have any taste. While when you fresh meal and use whole grain and those beautiful organic varieties of wheat, it's food that has a lot of taste and it has a lot of story You know, you often know the farmer growing those weeds, and it's pretty fun. So thank you for having me. Hope you guys have a good time. Thank you.